Hi, everybody, and welcome again to another edition of Mondays with Mike. Now, this one, it's very concerning. I'll put it this way. We are watching an incredible hurricane by the name of Milton. Now, this one, I mean, if you maybe weren't watching the news this morning, it is unbelievable how quickly this storm strengthened. So this is a visible satellite view of the storm. And this is where you can get the greatest amount of detail. And I just want you to sort of, first of all, look, the beautiful, ripples that we see coming out of the center here represent very fast upward movement of air. So these are actually called gravity waves that are coming out, or buoyancy waves that are coming out of the storm. Milton, this is what's amazing. So on Sunday morning, Milton was a tropical storm with winds of 60 miles per hour. As of this morning, Category 4 hurricane with winds of 150 miles per hour. Now, at the time that you're watching this, the storm continues to strengthen. Here's one bit of, well, I don't want to say encouraging, but look, we're looking for any signs of good news with this one, because the last thing we want is a Cat 5 headed toward Florida or toward the Yucatan. Most storms do not maintain Category 5 strength for longer than a day. So if this thing does become this huge monster hurricane, which it looks like it's going to, there's a chance that it may sort of reach its peak and then start to weaken a little before it heads toward Florida. It's not to say it's going to be helping that much, but we're definitely keeping our fingers crossed on this one. So the forecast on this one definitely does not look terrific. It is going to be heading again generally toward Tampa. This is a look at Clearwater Beach, Florida, as of this morning. And right now the Hurricane Center is predicting for them between an 8 to 12 foot storm surge coming up on Wednesday and Wednesday night. You know, these storms always hit at night, right? On Wednesday night. So if you could just imagine this pier and a 12 foot storm surge, up to here, I mean, it would just wipe it out. It would completely wipe out the beach. Now with Helene that just hit 2 weeks ago, the storm surge in this area was about 6 feet, 6 to 7 feet. And it was pretty bad. They actually had fatalities in this area. So we're really hoping for nothing worse than that. So I want to share a couple of models with you as we try to get an idea on what's happening with this. Now, I do think that it's probably going to take through the day today, maybe even until tonight, for the models to really catch up with what's happened with the system, just how quickly it's intensified to get a better hold of its future intensity and its future track. But this is a look at the futurecast of our Fox model, and it is showing the center of circulation. If this happens, if this verifies, it would be pretty much a worst case scenario for Florida, or a worst case scenario for the Tampa, St. Petersburg area as that system passes through. Actually, that was the GFS model I just showed you. Sorry about that. I have the Fox model loaded in here as well. So that was the GFS. That would potentially be a worst case scenario for the Tampa, St. Petersburg area. Let me run this through again here for you, because what's going to happen is you don't want to end up with the center of circulation up the coastline, because then you end up on that so-called dirty side of the circulation with the higher storm surge value. So again, here's a look at the GFS computer model, and if this verifies, and if that center of circulation moves in here north of the Tampa, St. Petersburg area, they would get an unbelievable, historic, probably storm surge. A couple of things could help out. One would be, obviously, if the storm weakens. Another would be if it happens to maybe hit farther up the coastline, closer to where Helene made landfall. That would lessen the load of the storm surge a little bit for Southwest Florida and for West Florida. So here's the Fox model that is sort of an alternative second opinion, I suppose, to the GFS computer model. And it's showing the storm moving a little bit slower with a larger eye, and probably moving in just a little bit farther to, well, you know what? It changed. It was moving farther to the north earlier this morning. Now it's come in line with the GFS model. This is a terrible, terrible situation for the Tampa-St. Pete area. The governor, Ron DeSantis, has declared a state of emergency. And along with that, mass evacuations are going to be taking place there on the west coast of Florida. And also, by the way, look, even inland locations like Orlando, Gainesville, and then back over to the east coast of Florida, Jacksonville and Daytona Beach could be getting in on very hazardous weather as well. Here's what we call our spaghetti model plot. And again, you know, the center of circulation pretty much centered around that Tampa-St. Pete area. One thing to note about the storm, though, too, is that it's not going to curve like Helene did and, you know, cause all that destruction in the Carolinas. This one's going to zip across and head out into the Atlantic Ocean. So a much faster moving system. This is the latest outlook from the National Hurricane Center. And all of this, of course, is subject to change. But for right now, they're showing this very large area in red from Cape Coral, Florida, up through the Tampa Bay area, and then heading up here to around Cedar Key, which is where Helene made landfall. And right now, that's the area that's in the 8 to 12 foot storm surge risk area. That's not a good situation at all. I got to adjust my tie here. That's a very bad situation. As far as our forecast and its effect on us locally, here's the thing. It's not really going to have that much of an impact. I mean, we're looking for beautiful conditions. It's going to be dry. We're going to have some cool mornings. We're going to have some warm afternoons. And really the only impact for our area here is going to be down in Galveston with increasing wave heights and things like that. Now, you may be wondering, how unusual is it for us to see a storm like this forming in the Gulf of Mexico this time of the year? Let's take a look. It's October, and we have this tremendously powerful hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. How rare is that? Well, it is rare. It definitely is rare. Is it without precedent? Kind of borderline. I mean, we're getting to the point that it is extremely rare. So what I've done here is I've plotted all of the October storms, meaning October hurricanes, that have occurred over the last 50 years in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, notice here in the Houston area, we have had one single hurricane to make landfall in our area over the last 50 years in October. That was Hurricane Jerry, which hit, I think, on the 16th. It was between the 15th and the 17th that it approached the area. So that's why we kind of call for the end of the Texas hurricane season mid-October, because it becomes just extremely rare for it to hit, for the exact reason that Milton is not hitting us. We get cold fronts coming through and the steering currents completely change. So there's no chance of Milton, turning and moving into our area. So you'll see there that, none of them move into Texas, or very few do. Each of the pink ones that are showing up are major hurricanes, or at least hurricanes that were major at one point. And you'll see there that some of them have gone into Florida over the last 50 years, but none have gone into the Tampa area. And none of them, it's not very common. So over the last 50 years, maybe like 4 of them, give or take, storms that may have just brushed by. What about when you go back as long as we have records? So this is a graphic that I put together that shows since 1850. Now, of course, you say, gosh, 1850, how did we know what was going on in 1850? We probably didn't catch every single hurricane in 1850, but for populated areas, we knew when a hurricane hit. Out in the middle of the ocean, maybe not. But this is all of the storms over the last 174 years that have passed within 50 miles of Tampa, Florida. And you'll see here that there are very few, but the one thing that caught my eye is how many formed in the general area that Milton is located, which is over here. And the answer is 2. So over the last 173 years, well, if you don't count this year, 173 years, there have only been 2 storms that have formed near where Milton is located and made landfall as a hurricane. And both of those storms, by the way, out here, occurred back in the 1800s. So we could say, I think the latest one was like 1880 something. So we're talking about at least, you're going back to the 19th century. It's been a long, long time that you've had anything formed down here. And by the way, Milton has already far exceeded the strength of those storms. by and large, most of the storms that hit that area this time of the year have come from the Caribbean Sea and moved up like this. So really rare for them to move across like that. So, I guess the question is it unprecedented? Maybe not in the grand history of the Earth. Who knows what happened in 1830 or 1740 or, back in the 1200s? Within the span of human existence, has this happened? I'm sure it has. But since we've been keeping records back to the 1850s, it has been an extremely rare occurrence for us to see something so strong in this part of the Gulf of Mexico and moving toward Florida. So just to summarize, yeah, it's definitely very, very uncommon. So let's talk about some of the effects that it may have on Florida. So we have what's called the Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale, and it's a scale based on wind speeds. It's called a damage potential scale, and it was invented or put together by Herbert Saffir, who was an engineer, and Dr. Robert Simpson, who used to be the head of the National Hurricane Center. This was back in the 70s. So what they did was they came up with these different categories, and based on wind speed, they estimate how much damage potential there is. So, category 5 would be like completely catastrophic, and category 1 would be more like minor wind damage. This obviously does not take into account rainfall or storm surge or anything like that. It's just strictly a damage potential scale. And so at a category 4 status, that goes up now to 156. Anything above that, which would basically be 160 or higher, becomes category 5. And this storm Milton has a very good chance of reaching category 5 status. So that's one threat, is going to be extreme wind for Florida, which obviously is probably the first thing you think about when you think hurricanes. Also, storm surge. So that is the rise in the sea level, the rise in the level of the water that is associated with the pushing of the water up against the coastline. Now, they had a very serious storm surge that occurred with Helene. When Helene made landfall up there, they ended up with about a 6 to 6.5 foot storm surge in the Tampa-St. Pete area, and some people did drown. Now, granted, there are a lot of folks that probably should have evacuated the coastline. In this case, they are going to evacuate the coastline. So we're going to have a much bigger evacuation, rightfully so, I think, for this area, compared to what we had with Helene a couple of weeks ago. The other thing that's a tough call is, look, I mean, it's not guaranteed where Milton is going to make landfall, which, by the way, would be Wednesday night, probably, late in the day on Wednesday. This model here, which is one of our proprietary models in our weather system, is calling for a landfall just to the south of Tampa. Now, if that's the case, then as far as the storm surge that we're looking at here from around Bradenton, Florida, down here to around Cape Coral, they're looking for this red, orange and red, which is anywhere from 6 to 12 feet of it. I mean, imagine that, 2 of me, basically, of an increase in water levels. Now, all of this is going to be shifted north or south, depending on where that center of circulation, where that eye makes landfall, because usually it's the right side of the eye, that what's called the front right quadrant, where you're going to have the greatest risk for storm surge. But this is going to be a pretty big deal and could potentially be close to what we had around here with Hurricane Ike, 2008. Another threat, flash flooding. So right now, the National Hurricane Center is showing from central Florida northward all the way into southern Georgia, this 3 out of 4 risk, or what's considered a moderate risk, but that's still pretty high risk, for getting in on flash flooding. So you've got the wind, you've got the rain, you've got the storm surge, and then finally you also have the risk for severe weather, which includes tornadoes. And that is going to cover much of the state. Notice even out here, like the Florida Keys, Miami and Fort Lauderdale and West Palm, areas that are pretty far away from the center of circulation, could get in on tornadoes. At least there's a risk for that. So it's important. It's an important lesson for us. We learned it in Beryl. It's an important lesson for everybody to never just focus in on the center of the cone. That only tells you the forecast track of the middle of the storm. These storms are huge and can have very wide-ranging impacts. As far as our local forecast, we're actually looking great. So let's take a look at that. All right, everybody, I've decided to move outside because the weather is just so outstanding here in Houston. And, we're going to see a lot more of this in the days to come. If you remember a couple of weeks ago when Hurricane Helene was hitting Florida and then obviously moved up to Georgia, caused catastrophic flooding in the Atlanta area, a flash flooding emergency, and obviously, Asheville, North Carolina has been getting a lot of attention because the town has been wiped out, parts of Tennessee. So while all that was happening over there, we had some beautiful, sunny, dry conditions. And it's going to be the same deal with Milton, as we have this extremely powerful storm that, as I mentioned, while not maybe not technically unprecedented, is extremely unusual in its strength and location for this time of the year. When you have that on one side of the Gulf of Mexico, you're going to have this nice dry wind flow and northerly breeze and sunny skies on the other side of the Gulf of Mexico. So rarely would you have, rainy weather in both situations. So we're really looking great around here for the next few days. The interesting thing about our local forecast is that we are getting dry air, but there isn't a lot of truly cold air behind this front that's going to be moving through here. And in fact, it's even hard to spot the front on a map. So we're going to just notice a gradual drop in our humidity values today and heading into Tuesday. And so what that's going to do is it is going to allow us to get noticeably cooler at night. Because when you have a clear sky and light winds and very low humidity, all of the heat, that's out here radiates back out into space. We call that radiative cooling, radiational cooling. And it leaves an infrared radiation. It just says bye-bye. So with that in mind, the ground cools off and you get some cooler air. So that happens at night. By the same token, if you don't have any cold air blowing in, what we call cold air advection, if you don't have that, then you still get hot during the day. And it looks like that's what's going to happen. In fact, we're probably looking at some low 90s. Depending on what model you're looking at, some are showing upper 80s, some are showing middle and upper 90s. So even just, I think the wise thing to do would be splitting the difference. We're still looking at 90, 91, 92 for high temperatures all this week. So that's going to be really interesting to wake up to like 50s and low 60s in the morning and then get all the way up to the 90s in the afternoon. That's going to be pretty interesting. So that's what we have going on in our local forecast. As I pointed out earlier, the hurricane season, even though technically hurricane season runs from June 1st to November the 30th, you probably know that, for Texas, really everything basically cuts off middle October. So remember I just showed you that graphic that had all the October hurricanes, and the latest one to hit Texas, at least on record, was Hurricane Jerry in 1989. That was in the middle of October. And that was the only one. So once we get past mid-October, that's kind of it. And it's for the exact same reasons that we're seeing such beautiful weather right now. You get the jet stream currents change. The weather moves in from the east during the summertime. Then the weather starts to move in from the west during the fall as the jet stream currents change, and it kind of pushes everything away from us. And so that's why it's rare for us to see anything really threaten us in October and November. But that's not to say it could never happen. I mean, when you look at this Milton that's happening out there right now, we haven't seen anything like that for a really, really long time. In fact, the two storms that, originated in the Gulf, in the southern Gulf, and moved toward Tampa happened in the 1800s. So they're very old. They just haven't happened for a long time. So, could Texas ever get a hurricane strike in late October or even November? Of course it's possible. But it's just much less likely. And if it were to hit that time of the year, it probably would be real short-lived and sort of absorbed with some drier air coming in and cooler air. So that's what's going on. The other thing that I wanted to point out, I'm not sure if I made it clear earlier, a moment ago, but This storm, Milton, is on a little bit of a different path than Helene was, because Helene, hit the Big Bend region of Florida and then moved up, up through Georgia and then kind of stalled over the Carolinas. And this one doesn't look like it's going to do that. It looks like it's just going to zip on through. So it's really only going to affect Florida directly for about a day. And then beyond that, it should be out of there, out into the Atlantic Ocean. So it's not going to be a really long-lived event, which is good. And probably more importantly, it's not going to curve and hit the Carolinas again, which obviously is very good. But what a year it's been. I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but this year, if and when Hurricane Milton makes landfall, it's going to be the 6th hurricane to hit the United States Gulf Coast this year. 6 in 1 year. What's even more interesting is that there have only been 13 total storms, or I guess 14 with Milton, but almost half the storms that have formed have hit the Gulf Coast of the United States. So early on in the season, we had 2 storms that hit the Gulf Coast of Mexico. Those are both tropical storms. And of course, we had Beryl, Category 1, that hit Texas. We had Debbie, which was a Category 1 that hit Florida. We had Francine, which was a Category 2 that hit Louisiana. We had Helene, which was a Category 4 that hit Florida. And we have Milton that might be a 3, 4, or 5 hitting Florida. Am I forgetting one? Beryl, Debbie, Francine, Helene. Gosh, am I forgetting one? There were 3 others in the Atlantic Ocean. Maybe it's the 5th hurricane to hit. Maybe I got that wrong. The 5th hurricane to hit on the Gulf Coast. The 7th overall named storm to make landfall on the Gulf Coast. So what's interesting is, remember before the season, and I never try to oversell those forecasts. I know if you watch me, I always say, you got to take all these forecasts with a grain of salt when we say how many storms are there going to be and how many named storms. And it really doesn't matter. Your preparations have to be the exact same every year, whether there's 1 storm or 30 storms. But it did turn out that, at least thus far, we haven't had those 25 storms or something like that have been expected. That being said, we have had a lot of storms in the Atlantic Ocean that formed in a flurry. While Helene was making all of the headlines in the in the Carolinas, we had the I, J, and K storms form. I think it was Isaac, Joyce, and Kirk formed in the Atlantic Ocean, and they all didn't hit land, so they didn't get that much attention. But we're still adding to the numbers. So when all is said and done, it may end up that we have a lot of activity in the Atlantic Ocean for the rest of October and even November, maybe even December. So I think eventually those numbers will catch up, and we'll end up probably getting to the W storm, or maybe having to go to the next alphabet. But the only thing that matters is whether it hits here. And I think that our hurricane season is sort of getting to the point where we can sort of breathe a sigh of relief, that we're not going to have to deal with any more storms. But this Milton, unfortunately, looks like it's going to be historic, especially since they just got hit. So my family is in Florida. A lot of you probably have family in Florida. For my brother and my mom and my friends and everything in South Florida, it's mainly going to be a threat of rain, heavy rain bands, and some high wind, but probably not catastrophic wind. And an occasional tornado is possible too. Farther up the coastline, they may get the second, you have the landfall, and then when it moves off the coastline, places like Daytona Beach and Cape Canaveral, NASA could get in on some really nasty weather. And then depending on where it makes landfall, man, that West Coast, I tell you, could get hit so hard. And remember, it was just a couple, 2021 with Hurricane Ian, which was a category 4/5. It was like right on the verge. And then you had Idalia, and they get a lot of ice storms. But yeah, Florida's had it rough. There were some stories that I read recently where some people are like, you know what, it's not worth it. I want to move somewhere where we're not going to have to deal with this anymore. So anyway, so that's what's going on. So we're hoping for the best, preparing for the worst. So shout out to my mom and Neil. I think probably you're going to be okay. I know you're going to be okay. I'm really disappointed though, because my little nephews who are 7 and 4, are almost 4. Gosh, I can't keep up with how old these kids are. They had to cancel their trip to Disney. They were supposed to go to Disney yesterday and stay till Thursday. They were supposed to go to Disney today and stay till Thursday, and they had to cancel the trip. And in hindsight, it looks like a really good idea they did. Of course, it wasn't their decision. It was Mom and Dad's decision. So anyway, we'll be keeping you up to date on this incredible Hurricane Milton for the remainder of the week. In the meantime, enjoy what is going to be an amazing weather week here in the Houston area.